Well, if you have your Bibles, you go ahead and turn them to the Gospel of John, chapter 2. As you're turning there, I've shown that video once or twice before, and I always crack up when I watch it because it's interesting how we approach God, how we approach church, how we approach worship, how we approach the Bible, how we approach all of that. When we come before God, when we are in His presence as a corporate body, or when we're seeking to be in His presence in our own personal relationship, how we approach Him, what He reveals to us, how we respond to that, it's interesting how it all plays out. The reality is, sometimes we don't see God as clearly as we ought to, or through the lens we're meant to see Him through. There's some things that we need to discover. As we're going through this Gospel of John series, looking at truths of Scripture that are meant to inform our faith in a way that informs the way that we respond, I think that's something that we need to be mindful of this morning. Again, this whole Gospel has an aim, has a purpose that is evident because John makes it evident for us. Each week I've been going through this particular verse, and hopefully by the end of this series, you're going to have this thing nailed down if you haven't got it nailed down already. But it helps remind us why these stories of Jesus are being told, why these accounts are recorded for us. John wrote this so that these are written that you might believe that He is the Messiah, that the Son of God, and that by believing, you may have life in His name. So as we look at Jesus and the accounts, and especially in this one today, because this is an account that, for me, it's a little peculiar. It's different than a lot of the other accounts that we see of Jesus. I don't know if it's more personal or more details or something, but it's just a really interesting account of what's happening in these initial moments where Jesus is interacting with some of His some of His disciples, those first interactions. And it's important for us to remember that this was written, this account that we're going to look at today, John 2, 1 through 12, was written so that we might believe that Jesus is the Messiah. And that by believing that truth and everything that it means, we might have life in His name. Now, a couple things I'm going to say about this account. This is a passage that sometimes is used to go back and forth between the debate on alcohol, whether you should drink or not drink, and some people point to this passage, and some people use this as a reason for or against or whatever. I want to say that that's not really the point of John 2. All right, I'm not going to focus on that this morning. I think that's part of the discussion. You can bring it in when we're talking about that particular issue. But I think if we focus on that detail, we miss out on what's really going on. And we miss out on some really powerful truths that we're reminded of in this passage. That God works in the midst of normal circumstances. And in the midst of normal circumstances, He reveals Himself to us in powerful ways. And when He reveals Himself, we're brought to a point where we got to do something with what He's shown us. And sometimes we can get lost in the wrong type of detail. And so I want to keep our focus on what I believe God is desiring to say to us through this passage this morning. So that being said, let's dive into this passage in John chapter 2 and begin reading. On the third day, a wedding took place at Cana in Galilee. Jesus' mother was there, and Jesus and His disciples had also been invited to the wedding. When the wine was gone, Jesus' mother said to Him, "They have no more wine." "Woman, why do you involve me?" Jesus replied. "My hour has not yet come." His mother said to the servants, "Do whatever He tells you." So from this first portion, I want us to notice something that I think is a little interesting. Jesus was initially resistant to getting involved in this circumstance. So they're at this wedding, right? He's interacting with His disciples, and the wine runs out, which for us probably doesn't hold the same weight as it did for people back then. If you ran out of whatever the preferred beverage was in the moment, for a party and you needed to get some more, well, you just run down to the convenience store. You can go to Meijer if you have to. I mean, 20, 30 minutes tops, the whole thing is resolved, right? Not so for those in first century Jerusalem. They ran out. There was no going to the convenience store down the road. And for a person in that culture, to run out of wine was something that you didn't do. It indicated you didn't plan well enough for this really, really important celebration that could last up to a week, right? And so it was a great dishonor to the bridegroom and his family. And so in the midst of this, Mary comes up to Jesus and says, listen, don't know how it happened, but they don't have any more. And Jesus' response is really peculiar, right? I mean, first off, we have to be careful not to read into it based on how we would engage with a person with conversation. So you see Jesus saying, woman, why do you involve me? Don't 21st century that statement, all right? Jesus isn't being disrespectful to his mom right now, right? We know that because in John chapter 19, he says the same phrase when he's talking to Mary from the cross, when he tells John, his apostle, to take care of him. Take care of him. Woman, this is your son. Son, this is your mother. Okay, so Jesus isn't being derogatory. So I'm going to make that clear before we really dive into. But again, why did he respond this way? I mean, why is he resistant to getting involved? I think Jesus knew what he was called to do. And his purpose in life was not to provide wine at weddings for those who ran out, right? He knew his mission. My hour has not yet come. My hour was, the purpose that I was sent here was to come and to save this world. And so he's initially resistant. This isn't my place. And really, if you look into the Greek, what Jesus says in this moment, woman, why do you involve me? He actually says in the Greek that it could be translated, what is that to you or to me? I mean, this isn't our place to get involved. This isn't our wedding to be responsible for, right? And so what Jesus is saying right now, it's not really the purpose. It's not my place in this moment. And so he was initially resistant to getting involved. But Mary, the mom, just says, well, you're involved whether you want to be or not, Jesus. Do whatever he tells you. Okay. Let's continue on and see what else we find from this passage. Oh, actually, I jumped ahead of myself. I got one more verse to share with you before we get to the passage. You see, Jesus was so fixed on his purpose. That's why he was initially resistant. He knew what he was called to do and how he was called to do it. It reminds me of Proverbs 4. Let your eyes look straight ahead. Fix your gaze directly before you. Give careful thought to the path for your feet and be steadfast in all your ways. It wasn't that Jesus didn't care about this couple and this wedding and all that took place. He just knew what he was called to do in the moment. And so he was initially resistant. So, my job is not to provide the wedding or the wine for all the weddings around that run out. All right, so he's initially resistant, but let's let the story continue and see how it plays out. Nearby stood 6 stone water jars, the kind used by the Jews for ceremonial washing, each holding from 20 to 30 gallons. Jesus said to the servants, fill the jars with water. So they filled them to the brim. Then he told them, now draw some out and take it to the master of the banquet. They did so, and the master of the banquet tasted the water that had been turned into wine. He did not realize where it had come from, though the servants who had drawn the water knew. Then he called the bridegroom aside and said, everyone brings out the choice wine first, and then the cheaper wine after the guests have too much to drink. And you have saved the best till now. As we look at this portion, taking a pause for a minute, I want us to note this. In revealing who he is, Jesus looks for our response. In revealing who he is, he looks for our response. It's interesting, some people make a great deal out, because there's details that are included that aren't necessarily always included in other stories, like there's 6 jars and they were used for cleansing rituals. And so some people draw allusions that, oh, this is a symbolism for this. God was doing something because he had 6 specific jars and it represents this. And the whole idea of them being used for cleansing rituals is really important, because maybe what he's saying is Jesus can take what we give him, our water, and turn it into wine, transform us and cleanse us and make us new. I don't know if this passage is talking about any of that. Right? All I know is that those jars facilitated what was needed in order for Jesus to provide the wine that he was going to do. And so to read too much more into that, well, maybe it can be encouraging and maybe it isn't. But whatever it was, these jars didn't symbolize. These jars were vessels that God could use to provide what was needed. Right? And remember, this was for a week-long celebration. I remember reading this passage one time and thinking, okay, so there's a wedding. They've already drunk a bunch of wine. And then Jesus goes and he provides 120 to 180 gallons worth of wine. That's a bit excessive for a couple-hour celebration, isn't it? Again, this is a week-long celebration. Could last up to a week. And so when we look at that, God isn't being overly extravagant necessarily. He's providing for what probably was needed throughout the course of the rest of the week for this wedding. But I think those details considered, it's the response of the servants that really caught my eye as I was looking at this passage. I mean, think about their actions in this. So they run out of wine. Or they didn't run out of wine, the wedding ran out of wine. And these servants are partially responsible for helping to make sure that more is acquired, right? And so Mary tells the servants, do whatever Jesus tells you. And he says, hey, look, there's 6 big jars contain 120, 180 gallons worth of potential liquid. Fill those up with water. If you're a servant and Jesus tells, why am I wasting my time filling these jars up with water? All right, Jesus, we need wine. We don't need a bunch of water, a bunch of cleansing ritual things. Could you imagine being the servant in that position, wanting to have a debate with why Jesus is asking you to do what he's calling you to do? And then think about it. They filled it to the brim. They left no room for someone else to come in and kind of make some watered down wine. Right? Like maybe initially you could have thought, well, if they fill it like 3/4 of the way, then someone else can provide some wine, they can water that down, and at least it's something, right? No, they filled it to the brim. And then, have you ever thought about when did it change? Like they filled it with water, they knew it was water when they poured it in, and was it instantaneous? Or some people have said, no, the water didn't turn to wine until they delivered it to the master of the banquet. Whatever it was, these servants had to take steps of faith. Jesus says, listen, go to that master, dip your vessel in the water and take it to him. Again, imagine being a servant. He's looking for wine, and you give him what you thought was water initially. What kind of courage that must have taken. As Jesus is revealing who he is, he always looks for our response. He's concerned about the way that we're reacting, how we're trusting him. It reminds me of this Isaiah 119 passage, that if we are willing and obedient, we will eat the good things of the land. You see, the servants, in order to experience what they experienced, had to take steps of faith, had to walk in obedience to what Jesus was saying, what Jesus was revealing to them. And sometimes we miss out on the good things of the land because we're not willing to continue to trust Jesus through acts of obedience to what he has revealed to us through his word. And it shows. Let's finish the passage. What Jesus did here in Cana of Galilee was the first of his signs through which he revealed his glory. And his disciples believed in him. After this, he went down to Capernaum with his mother and brothers and his disciples. There they stayed for a few days. As we look at this passage, this thought came to mind. Jesus continued to walk in wisdom to accomplish his mission. So the first thing, before we get into explaining that statement, John makes this commentary. This was the first of his miracles that Jesus performed, revealing who he was to his disciples, and they put his faith in him. Again, these things were written so that you might believe, and that by believing you might have life in his name. That's why this story is recorded with all its kind of peculiar details. Jesus' initial resistance, Jesus' reactions, the acts of how they provided the miracle. But this was done so that people could see who Jesus was. A glimpse. Not the full picture, obviously, but a glimpse that there's something different about this man than other people. Now, going back to this point, Jesus' response to the occasion is a bit interesting, right? I mean, a great miracle has been accomplished. God has been doing something awesome in the midst of these people. And what does he do? He gets up and he goes 17 miles away to Capernaum. Again, first century Jerusalem, right? That's not like driving to a town nearby where you can do it in 20 minutes. That's walking a day's journey to the next town, or to a town a distance away. Isn't that interesting? Like, I would have been like, all right, let me tell you something. I just did this awesome thing. Now let me teach you about the kingdom of God right on the tail end, because everyone's excited because of this. Well, those who knew what happened was excited based on this huge miracle. And you can bet those servants weren't keeping that news to themselves, right? Word quickly got out that I'm sure of what happened and how Jesus did this amazing miracle. And I'm sure people's hearts were, are you kidding me? That's amazing. If I was thinking about building a ministry, I would have capitalized on that event, right? But Jesus doesn't do that, because his purpose wasn't to be the guy who ran a business and turned a bunch of water into wine and make a huge profit and amaze a bunch of people. He was sent for a purpose, and he walked in wisdom to accomplish that mission. And he knew that if he stayed, well, he knew the hearts of man and how reactionary they were to amazing things. Could have distracted him for the purpose for which he was sent. So he goes to a town 17 miles away. And there he spends time with his mother and his brothers and his disciples and begins to process a little bit more. He also did it for his disciples' sake. Again, we know that Peter was prone to make reactionary statements that he didn't think through yet quite quickly. And they needed time to understand what Jesus was about. It wasn't about just doing signs and miracles and doing these amazing things. They needed to understand and begin to understand who he was and what he was sent to do. Jesus didn't get sidetracked. He didn't want to get caught up in the midst of potential distractions to his purpose. Right? So in the midst of this account, with all the weirdness and things that have happened, he goes to that town and he just takes some time for a couple days and he's with his disciples. It's a really interesting story. To be honest, as I was going through it, approaching it, I should say, at the beginning of the week, I was going, okay, where are we going to go with this? Right? This is not one of those salvation plan, really easily laid out messages that just kind of falls together and you already kind of have an idea of the direction of where you're heading from the outset. I approached this and I'm like, this is an interesting story. In fact, I think, to be honest, this is the first time I've ever preached John 2, verse 1 through 12. Usually I just kind of like, well, there's a wedding and then let's move on to some of the other things. But there's truths that we need to learn. Again, God steps into the midst of the mundane, everyday circumstances of our lives, and he reveals something of himself to us. And from that revelation, we're called to do something with it. And so there's a couple things as we think about this passage that I want to talk about now. The first is this: do we know what Jesus is able to do among us? Think about the perspective of the disciples. This is some of their first interactions with Jesus. as they went to that wedding, who did they think he was? What did they think he was able to do? How did this instance, this circumstance, this experience change their way of thinking, change their approach to how they viewed Jesus and what he was going to be able to accomplish? You see, as they spent time with Jesus, they came with assumptions. They came with all sorts of things that expectations and sometimes misinformation about who he was and what he was going to do. And you can believe that we still do that today. That as we spend time with Jesus, there's things that we know about God based on our experiences. But God still has something to reveal to us about who he is and what he's able to do among us. Do we know what Jesus is able to do in the midst of our situations? As I was thinking about that question, a verse popped into my mind. It's one of my favorite verses in Ephesians chapter 3. I sometimes describe it like that because some books are just like every 10 verses there seems to be an amazing passage, and Ephesians for me is just one of those. But in Ephesians 3:20 it says this: "Now to him who is able to do immeasurably more." I really like what the ESV says in that passage. It says, "To him who is able to do far more abundantly." Immeasurably sums it up pretty well too. "Immeasurably more than all we ask or imagine, according to his power that is at work within us." Do we know what Jesus is able to do among us? He's able to do immeasurably more than all we ask or imagine. Do we know that? Because I guarantee you, the disciples thought they knew a little bit about what Jesus was able to do based on their expectations, but they didn't know he could do that. They didn't know he could fill up some water jars and somehow turn those into wine to help meet a need for the moment in the midst of the mundane and the everyday regular flows of life. They experienced something and they knew something a little differently as a result of it. And you might be sitting there thinking, well, Pastor Ricky, listen, I've got some details in my circumstances that I just don't know how God is able to work among them. Well, I'm glad you said that. Because it brings to mind Romans chapter 4. Speaking of Abraham, it says this: "He did not waver through unbelief regarding the promise of God, but was strengthened in his faith and gave glory to God, being fully persuaded that God had power to do what he had promised." If you're unfamiliar with Abraham's story, God tells him, hey, you're going to have a child. Okay. He waits a long time and it's not happening. Like he's getting old. Right? And there's some other details that I'm not going to cover, but he gets to age 100 and he says, your wife Sarah is going to be the one that you have the child with. She's like 90. 190. You're going to be parents. There'd be a lot of like, listen, I don't think that's going to work. I kind of want it to work, but really that's... And what does the passage say? In the midst of all of his details and what God was able to do, Abraham was strengthened in his faith as he gave glory to God, being fully persuaded. Do you know what it means to be fully persuaded that God is able to work in your circumstance? It means you're not going to be convinced otherwise. That God was able and that God had the power to do what he had promised. Do we know what Jesus is able to do among us, among the everyday details of our lives? Or do we find ourselves like the bridegroom in this circumstance? I got no wine and I got no way to provide it. What am I going to do? And as we're thinking about this thought of do we know what God is able to do, because that question influences the way that we respond to circumstances. Do we know what he is able to do, or do we take matters into our own hands? Reminds me of this story. A little girl has a problem. See, she has this brother, and her brother likes to trap rabbits. Likes to hunt them in that way. And she was worried because she didn't want the little bunnies to get hurt, right? Her heart was very sensitive toward that topic. And so she begged her brother, please don't set your traps out there. Don't hurt those rabbits. She pleaded with him, but he refused to change his plans. And so the little girl chose another course of action and was able to sleep with confidence that night because she knew that the rabbits would be safe. She later explained, I prayed to God that he wouldn't let those cute rabbits be harmed in those cruel traps. And then I went outside and I broke all those traps into a million pieces. You see, sometimes we believe God is able to do something, and then when time elapses for a little bit longer, we take matters into our own hands. Right? I'm going to fix this situation. I'm going to do it this way. I'm going to work my will out, how I want it to be done. I'll throw a prayer up to God, but if he's not answering immediately, I'm going to go a different direction. Do we know what God is able to do among us? That being said, it leads me to this other thought, which initially might sound contradictory to what I've just been talking about. Jesus rarely moves without requiring some response. As we look at this account, again, think about it. In the passage, those servants had to fill up the water. Or not fill up the water, had to fill up the jars with water. Those servants had to take that water to the master of the banquet. Response was required in order to fully see this miracle play out, to really see God at work. And it's amazing how many times, it's not that God is limited by our inaction as if he couldn't. He chooses to work through our responses most often. And it's countless different examples of that. Luke 6, he tells a man who was gathered for worship on the Sabbath, stretch out your hand. No, I don't want to stretch out my hand. It's limp. I don't want to make a big deal out of my handicap here. I already have a complex about that. I'm not going to stretch out my hand. Is that what the man does? No, he stretches out his hand and he's healed. There's a response there. Luke 17, some lepers are coming to Jesus and say, hey, can you help us out? And Jesus says, go and show yourself to the priests. They're not healed at that moment. On the way, as they're going, they're healed, and one of them turns back and gives praise to God. There's another account. In John chapter 9, the man who was born blind. Jesus spits in some mud, which is an interesting thing, rubs it on his face, but what does he say to the man? Go and wash in the pool of Siloam. Response was required. Matthew chapter 9, there's a couple blind guys who want to be healed of their blindness, and Jesus says to them, do you believe that I am able to do this? You see, when Jesus moves, when God moves in our circumstances, it's almost always going to require some type of response from us, some act of faith. God chooses to work among us in partnership with us. We can't just sit back and do nothing. Right? We can't just sit back and expect him to do everything in our circumstances. Now, again, there's a right response and there's a wrong response, and we got to make sure that we are responding in a way that's honoring to what God has called us to do and not trying to take matters into our own hands. But at the same time, response is still required. It reminds me of this quote I ran across from Josh McDowell. Obedience to God's commands not only protects us from harm, it also allows God to provide for us, sometimes in breathtaking ways. When God moves, response is usually required. And when we respond, when we are obedient to what God is calling us to do and what his word says, not only does it lead us on the path of life and keep us from getting caught in a bunch of things that could be harmful to us, but God ends up revealing something to us that we wouldn't have seen otherwise. If those disciples hadn't answered the call to follow Jesus, they wouldn't have been at the wedding. They wouldn't have seen that miracle take place. Response is important. So let me ask you, what have you been seeking lately? How have you been asking God to move in the midst of your circumstance? One, does it align with the truth of his word? Does it reflect the right response as you are doing what he has called you to do and as you're trusting in him to do what you can't do? I think for us, as we're asking ourselves this question, we're just left with this statement from Mary in our passage. She tells Jesus about the situation. Jesus responds the way he does. And what does she say to the servants? Do what he says. Do we do what he says? Do we put our faith into practice as we're called to? Something this passage reminds me of is this truth. With time, Jesus reveals more of himself to us. Again, had the disciples not been there, they wouldn't have seen something about Jesus that they needed to know about who he was. That was going to begin to chip away at the expectations and all the assumptions that they had about who the Messiah was, what he was sent to do, what he was going to accomplish. And it's amazing when people spend time with Jesus in the scriptures, how their eyes are opened in ways that they weren't otherwise open to. There's a Pharisee named Simon in one account in Luke chapter 7. As I'm thinking about this right now, I'm just going to remind us of this. When I reference a passage that is not the passage that we're covering each week, I put those in the bulletin. Not the bulletin, that connection newsletter that I send out on Mondays, so that you're able to go back to the passages and look at the accounts. This one happens to be from Luke 7, where there's a Pharisee named Simon who has a dinner for Jesus, and they're spending time and they're breaking bread, and this woman comes and essentially she had a reputation, and Simon said, if you were if you're the Messiah, surely you're a prophet, you would know the type of woman that's touching you. Jesus reveals a little bit about this man's heart and about his purpose, that God came to save everyone, even those with reputations. He wouldn't have known that had he not spent time with Jesus, had he not allowed his prejudices to be confronted. But because he spent time with Jesus, something was revealed to him. There's another account on the road to Emmaus with the two disciples that Jesus was revealing a little bit more of himself through the Old Testament along the way, and they get to the table later in Luke 24, and then they sit down with Jesus, and then as they're breaking bread, their eyes are open, they see him for who he is. Jesus reveals himself to those who take time to spend time with him. And without taking time, sometimes we don't see something that could really be helpful to our faith and our journey. So you have to ask this question: what might you be missing because you haven't taken the time to seek the Lord? All these disciples were doing was following Jesus and spending time at a wedding, and their lives were impacted greatly as a result. As I was thinking about this point, I had this thought. I don't know if you guys remember these, but they're called autostereograms. Does that ring a bell for anybody? Not really? They also are referred to as magic eye pictures. Not yet? Well, maybe this image will help. Do you remember these? Maybe like 20 years ago, these were like huge. And these used to be the source of some of my greatest frustrations in life. If you've ever tried to see, essentially what it is there's an image embedded in that if you look at this long enough, if you maybe cross your eyes, get focused, whatever, you can see the image, right? This one happens to be of a shark. You can go ahead and waste your time and not listen to a thing that I say for the rest of the sermon and try to find that shark. I couldn't. And the more I looked at this image and couldn't find it, the more frustrated I became. And you know, that was part of my problem, I think, when I was younger, too, is I would get frustrated. It wouldn't happen as quickly as I wanted it to. I'd stare at the thing for hours, and it just wasn't clear. Isn't that sometimes like our relationship with God? Isn't that sometimes like our circumstances? God, what are you doing in this mess? I'm staring at it. I'm looking at it from all angles, and all I am is frustrated by it. I can't see clearly where you're at in this. And the idea with these is the longer you stare at the image and focus on it with the right heart, the more it becomes a little clearer. And the more you spend time with Jesus, the more things become a little clearer in your circumstances. You might not see all the details, but slowly over time, an image starts to take shape. Oh, I didn't see that before. I think this is a great, helpful comparison. Maybe just for me, but I think for all of us. It takes time to see with clarity. It takes time spending with Jesus for him to begin to help us see how things are taking shape. And so what that reminds me of in this point, that with time Jesus reveals more of himself to us, calls me to seek him with all of my heart. Jeremiah chapter 29, verses 12 through 13 says this, "Then you will call upon me and come and pray to me, and I will hear you. You will seek me and find me when you seek me with your heart." You see, when I was younger, I would stare at that picture. Nothing happened after 2 minutes. I would just go about my business. Not worth my time. I've got other things to do, more important things to do. And sometimes we can approach God that way. Okay, I'm gonna pray, Lord, I'm gonna focus for usually I can pray for about 3 or 4 minutes, but I'm gonna give you 5 or 6 this time. I really need an answer here, and we'll pray for 5 or 6 minutes. He doesn't answer. I've got other things I gotta do. I can't take time to allow you to reveal yourself more to me in this circumstance. And sometimes we just end up missing out on the image and the beauty of what God is doing behind the scenes. Is that connecting? Is that landing somewhere for someone this morning? One other thought before we finish up our passage. Kind of going back to a thought I hinted at in the first point. As we think about what we're going to do with this, not only are we called to seek after the Lord and ask him to reveal truth to us, I think this also is a reminder. Not that. That would make you think that this sermon is over, and that's just not the case. I'll let someone else go back there. I can't go back on it. It's being funny with me. So, the point that's going to magically appear as we look at the screen, one more screen back. No, actually, that's way forward. There it is, right there. Our love for others compels us to press pause at times. Again, Jesus responded a peculiar way in our passage. What does this have to do with me? My hour has not yet come. I've got a mission. I've got a focus. I've got things I'm sent here to do. But in the midst of his mission, Jesus' love for people compelled him to say, hey, okay, I'm going to step into the story. I'm going to show love to these people. And at the same time, my disciples are going to learn something a little bit about me as well. Even though Jesus wasn't sent to turn water into wine, it wasn't his purpose, he had this opportunity to love. I don't know if you can be like me at times where sometimes I hold on, I get tunnel vision. I can embrace my to-do list. Okay, this is what I've got to get done. And sometimes it has nothing to do even with what my purpose is and what God's called me to do. But I get tunnel vision. I've got to get these things, they've got to be accomplished. And that sometimes I miss the person beside of me because I have to get it done. But Jesus' love for others compelled him to press pause for a moment. He embraced the Father's purposes, but he also loved the people around him. Does our love for other people compel us to say, you know what, I've got to get this done, but here's a need? It reminds me of the parable of the Great Samaritan, right? 2 guys walking by that guy who had fallen into the hands of robbers, and they said, nope, I've got places to be. I ain't got time to deal with this guy on the side of the road. But there was one guy who said, you know what, someone needs help. And this is an urgent need. This isn't one of those, hey, he's just being negligent. He could die if I don't step into this circumstance. He was compelled to press pause. There's a lot of other instances where we see Jesus being focused on his mission, eyes fixed towards Jerusalem, and yet he stops to heal a blind man on the side of the road. Or he allows children to come to him and spends time and just blesses them. Or other moments where ministry was busy and he got bad news about John the Baptist being beheaded, and yet these crowds were coming, and he stops and he feeds 5,000 men, and in addition to that, women and children. His love for others compelled him to press pause at times and take advantage of an opportunity to share that love. Does our love for others compel us to press pause as well? To say, you know what? God's at work here. And I need to do what I can do to help out. It's an interesting account. Again, when I set out to preach this message this past week, I didn't think it was going to shape out like this. I didn't necessarily even imagine how God could speak so powerfully through the everyday circumstances of life. But again, he shows me he does. A wedding in Cana. And yet, it was more than a wedding. And isn't that like life? Monday is going to come tomorrow, but it's more than a Monday. God is at work trying to reveal something to us. How are we responding to what he is revealing to us about himself? Are we being more conformed into the image of who he was, as we're called to do? By his grace, is he helping us to become more and more like him? I'll finish off with this story. It's the story of a famous sculptor, and his name was Gutzon Borglum, which is, I think, just a really cool name. If there are any people looking to have kids in the future, Gutzon Borglum would be just a fantastic name. Like, I would want my picture taken with that, and I would probably display with that child, and I'll display it in my house if you will name your kid Gutzon Borglum. But Gutzon Borglum was a sculptor. And one of his great works is the head of Lincoln that's in the nation's capital. He cut it from this large block of stone. One day, when the face was beginning to take shape within it, become a little bit more visible, this young girl came along and asked, "Hey, is that Abraham Lincoln?" To which he replied, "Yes." And she asked the question, "Well, how in the world did you know he was in that block of stone?" As we spend time with Jesus and he reveals something to us, he's a sculptor. And we might look like a block of stone at times. But slowly, as we spend time with him and allow his spirit to work in our lives, things begin to take shape. And it's a slow process, as sculpting is. And there are times we look at the image and we think, okay, is it time for him to scrap and start over? And he's saying, no, I'm just continuing to chip away at some stuff. Things are going to come more clear to you. Just give me time. Allow me to shape your life. Cana in Galilee. It's an interesting passage of Scripture. And yet, it's really powerful if we allow it to be, because it shows us God at work in the midst of the mundane. And so how are you going to respond to this message? What are you going to do with the truths that we talked about? Hopefully it's not just a, hey, that was neat, let's move on and go to lunch. That's why we include this prayer time, 3 minutes. You can ask, Lord, how am I being led to worship you in light of what this passage is talking about? How am I being led to trust you in the midst of my circumstances? How am I going to respond to this? How am I going to respond to what his will is as it's been revealed to us through the Scriptures? Is there anything that I have need of that I need to let go or take hold of? Is there relationships that I need to make right because they haven't been made right? And this passage is hitting on some of those. And I know God is calling me to do something. Extend forgiveness, receive forgiveness. And how am I going to be led to respond from this point on? What am I going to do differently as a result of this week? How is September 27th, the week of it, going to be different in my life because this passage revealed to me something that I needed to hold on to today? That's what those questions are all about. They're up there every week because we got to do something with this message. We can't just let it be something that comes at us and we don't hold on to. So take time, reflect on the message before the worship team comes back up.